many other...
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Simon Marks, and in this bulletin, we'll get you a roundup of stories developing all over the world. First up, the day's top headlines. After US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's warning to cease aggressive actions in the Indo-Pacific, Beijing hits back at Washington. The Chinese Foreign Ministry says the US is inciting divisions among ASEAN nations. The United States says it's preparing alternatives with allies in case talks on reviving the Iran nuclear deal fail. Iran accuses Western powers of a blame game in Vienna. The UN says it's received credible allegations of more than 100 extrajudicial killings in Afghanistan since the Taliban took power in August, most of them carried out by the Taliban. A 5-year legal battle over the abuse scandal that rocked US sport comes to an end. USA Gymnastics and the US Olympic Committee agree to a $380 million settlement with the victims of sexual predator Larry Nassar. Sluggish vaccination drives lead to huge vaccine wastage in African nations. At least 200,000 doses of COVID-19 vaccines expired in Senegal without being used, while Nigeria is set to destroy 1 million doses of vaccine. And scientists warn that one of the biggest glaciers in Antarctica could experience dramatic changes in the next 3 to 5 years. They say an ice shelf holding it back from the sea could shatter like a car's windscreen. We begin here in Washington today. US President Joe Biden is facing mounting criticism from the American public. According to the latest ABC News Ipsos poll, Biden's approval rating has fallen to its lowest level yet over COVID-19, his handling of the economy and gun violence. The poll says only 28% of Americans approve of Biden's handling of the inflationary pressures that are now besetting the economy, while 69% disapprove. The US president has witnessed a drop in approval rates over his handling of the economy more broadly. 41% of Americans approved of his handling in December. That's compared to 47% back in October. Amid ongoing concerns over the Omicron variant of COVID-19, mask mandates and travel restrictions have been renewed in some parts of the United States. But the president has taken a significant hit in Americans' faith in his handling of the pandemic. 53% of people say they still approve of Joe Biden's response, but that number has dropped 20 percentage points since March. Joe Biden's approval rating also slid over his handling of gun violence and crime. This year, the United States has experienced a surge in gun violence and deaths. The president faces a 7% drop in his handling on both issues since October. According to the poll, 2/3 of Americans disapprove of Biden's handling of gun violence, while 32% approve. Those numbers are the lowest since the president took office this January. For more, let's cross live now to my WION correspondent Susan Tehrani. She joins us once again live from New York. And Susan, in none of these areas was this where the White House wanted to be as Joe Biden headed towards the end of his first year in the presidency.
Absolutely, Simon, and what a difference a year makes with those promising slogans that he had really 10, 12 months ago. But, you know, one of the issues with all of these is the way that the Biden administration has been handling these situations, from the economy to COVID to crime in recent months. One issue, I think, is the fact that President Biden himself seems to be missing in action. He hasn't been able to address the American people often enough and frequent enough and update them perhaps in person about his policies and his measures. While he does take questions from the press every now and then, he has come across as being someone who's being handled by his handlers. You can't underestimate that, and that affects his image and the way that he's handling, and whether or not he himself, as the President of the United States, has a grip on what's happening in the country. And then there's the fact that he blames, and his administration blames, the economy. I mean, we can go on and on every one of these issues, but you know, it's the holiday season. Bread, just the basic staples, they are at an all-time high. Thanksgiving dinner cost the American public a very high, you know, it was very expensive, higher than it ever was in 50 years. Going out to a basic NBA game, for example, is 34% higher. An NBA ticket is 35% higher than it was even last year, you know. So you have that, you have holiday shopping, you have basic staples. That's the economy on the one hand. On the other hand, urban cities are seeing a high rate of crime. You can't go out and, you know, take your kids out in the street. And then to top it all off, the cornerstone of his administration, his campaign promise, was the coronavirus issue, and he hasn't been able to get a grip on that either. I mean, there's constant infighting, partisan infighting on the one hand, and then, you know, the issue with the American public on the other. So this is where we stand right now. I think the main issue is President Biden needs to step up and really create an image for himself that he has a grip on the country.
Susan, can we just drill down into that issue of inflation for a moment? You spoke about rising prices. We're all seeing them here in the United States. You can't avoid them. Earlier in the year, the former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who's not part of Joe Biden's administration, warned the White House of the risk of inflationary pressures and was absolutely dismissed angrily by the White House, who pushed back at the notion that some of the president's plans were going to create inflationary pressures in America. Now Joe Biden is conceding, as he put it last week, that inflation is a real bump in the road. But it's a dramatic problem politically, isn't it? Because it is pocketbook issues. It is that fundamental question about whether you're better off today than you were 4 years ago or 2 years ago in the case of the midterm elections that are coming up, that are really going to bedevil the White House.
Inflation is a huge issue, and you know, there is a term that this administration has come up with, and that's permanent. That the fact that this transitory inflation might become permanent, permanent transitory. I mean, that's sort of an oxymoron. And when Janet Yellen talks about the transitory nature of this inflation, well, the American public really can't afford that right now, coming out of COVID on the one hand, and on the other hand, telling them that inflation is going to be something that's going to sit with you for a while is not something that they were promised. And the reason I was smiling about Larry Summers was because on the one hand, you know, they couldn't come out and completely criticize Larry Summers, and on the other hand, Larry Summers at that time sort of felt he didn't really feel bad, but he had to sort of sidetrack and say, listen, I agree with everything President Biden is doing, but this one thing you really have to be careful with, and here we are right now. But when you talk about inflation, the problem is it's not just inflation. It means that cost of living is not only going high, but the value of living is also going low. And it's not just the holiday season. I mean, you can blame it on the supply chain crisis, but then you have rents going up, you have the cost of education going up, and those aren't things that are stuck on a ship in the coast of California, for example. You know, rents aren't stuck on a ship over there. So this is a main issue. It's a big issue. The Republicans, yes, are going to take advantage of that. It is going to cost the Democrats seats, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it is hurting the American public, and that's something that this administration cannot deny. Their economic policies failed tremendously, and giving free checks in the mail is really not going to help them. They want to get back to work, and I don't think Americans are used to seeing inflation like this. I mean, I think you would agree.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to tell people that prices aren't rising when they feel every day in their pockets. And those inflation numbers that came out last Friday, the greatest rate of increase in the United States since 1982. Susan Tehrani, live for us, WION's correspondent in New York. Thanks very much for being there again today. We'll talk to you again soon. Let's move on to other news now. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has urged China to cease aggressive actions in the Indo-Pacific. He spoke during his visit to Indonesia as part of his three-nation Southeast Asia tour. Blinken said that Washington will work with allies and partners to defend the rules-based order in a bid to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific.
We'll work with our allies and partners to defend the rules-based order that we built together over decades to ensure the region remains open and accessible. And let me be clear about one thing. The goal of defending the rules-based order is not to keep any country down. Rather, it's to protect the right of all countries to choose their own path, free from coercion, free from intimidation. It's not about a contest between a U.S.-centric region or a China-centric region. The Indo-Pacific is its own region. Rather, it's about upholding the rights and agreements that are responsible for the most peaceful and prosperous period this region and the world has ever experienced. That's why there's so much concern from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia and from the Mekong River to the Pacific Islands about Beijing's aggressive actions.
Well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry wasted time hitting back at the Secretary of State, saying that America is inciting divisions among ASEAN nations.
就应当做地区对话与合作的促进者，而不是挑拨地区国家关系、破坏地区团结合作的搅局者。美方挑动分裂隔阂、煽动对立对抗的做法，在世界上不受欢迎，在亚太地区更加行不通。
Blinken's much-anticipated Southeast Asia trip comes amid heightened tensions with China. The region is central to Washington's Indo-Pacific policy, playing a key role for the US in countering China's growing influence across the Southeast Asian region. In the first leg of his tour, Blinken landed in Indonesia, where he met President Joko Widodo. He congratulated his host on Indonesia's G20 presidency and expressed support for its Indo-Pacific leadership role. The duo also discussed bilateral and regional cooperation, the climate crisis and, of course, COVID-19. Blinken also signed a number of agreements with top Indonesian officials, including memoranda of understanding on maritime operations and the Peace Corps programs in Indonesia. He also signed an agreement on education cooperation with Indonesia's Education Minister, Nadiem Anwar. This is Antony Blinken's first visit to Southeast Asia since President Joe Biden took office in January. He will also be visiting Malaysia and Thailand to boost ties in the region and counter Beijing's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea. European diplomats are shuttling between American and Iranians in Vienna over nuclear negotiations. The talks have not made the progress that was envisaged just a couple of weeks ago, and senior British, French and German diplomats are now warning that if they don't make headway, the negotiations will soon become, quote, an empty shell. The so-called E3 diplomats issued a statement statement saying that they have still not been able to get down to brass tacks. And US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the US is now preparing for alternatives in case efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal collapse.
Two things. First, with regard to Iran, I would refer you to a statement that I saw published by the E3, by the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. And it made a few points. It said very clearly, time is running out, that Iran has still not engaged in real negotiations. Unless there is swift progress, the E3 said, the Iran nuclear agreement will become an empty shell. And what we've seen so far is Iran losing precious time by advancing totally new positions that are inconsistent with a return to the JCPOA. We continue in this hour, on this day, to pursue diplomacy because it remains, at this moment, the best option. But we are actively engaging with allies and partners on alternatives.
But Iran insists that there has been progress made on the creation of an agenda for the talks. Iranian officials maintain they are serious about committing to the negotiations. The West, however, accuses Tehran of backtracking on positions it previously held. Iran's top negotiator, Ali Bagheri Khani, said that though good progress has been made with world powers, some actors persist in a blame game instead of diplomacy. Iran also said that European countries have failed to offer constructive proposals to help salvage the deal. The 2015 agreement aimed to prevent Iran from developing an atomic bomb. The deal ensured sanctions relief in return for tight curbs on Iran's nuclear program. Now President Biden has sought a mutual return to compliance with the deal, but Iran wants Washington first to lift a raft of sanctions that remain in place. A long legal battle in the Larry Nassar abuse scandal, which rocked US sport and society more generally, has come to an end. Victims of the former doctor for the US women's gymnastics team reached an $80 million settlement with USA Gymnastics, the sport's governing body, as well as the US Olympic Committee and their insurers. Nassar was sentenced to over 300 years in jail in 2018 for molesting gymnasts.
After a 5-year legal battle, victims of former USA Gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar reached a $380 million settlement with USA Gymnastics, the US Olympic, and their insurers, an attorney for some of his victims said on Monday. The Wall Street Journal reported earlier on Monday that the settlement will cover claims brought by Olympic gold medalists, including Simone Biles, Ali Reisman, and Michaela Maroney, all of whom are among Nassar's most high-profile victims of sexual abuse.
That evening, I was naked, completely alone, with him on top of me, molesting me for hours.
All three women testified about the abuse they suffered during a Senate hearing earlier this year. They blasted USA Gymnastics and Olympic officials for failing to stop Nassar, and they took the FBI to task over its botched investigation into Nassar's actions. As part of the settlement, USA Gymnastics and the Olympic Committee also agreed to designate some of their board seats to survivors and to implement new policies aimed at protecting athletes from future abuse. The disgraced physician, who had been the main doctor for Olympic gymnasts for 18 years, was sentenced in federal court in 2017 to 60 years in prison.
Because, sir, you don't deserve to walk outside of a prison ever again.
The following year, he was also sentenced to up to 175 years in Michigan for molesting female gymnasts under his care.
As the new highly mutated Omicron variant drives a fourth wave of infections in South Africa and the UK, concerns are mounting over whether other African nations are prepared to deal with the new threat. Along with a sluggish vaccine rollout, the continent is also battling a crisis of vaccine wastage. It's reported that at least 200,000 COVID-19 vaccines have expired in Senegal without being used over the past 2 months, while another 200,000 doses are set to expire by the end of the year. Logistical problems, the vaccine's short shelf life and jab hesitancy are said to be the main reasons behind the sluggish rollout. Senegal has so far administered nearly 2 million doses of vaccines, inoculating only 5.9% of its population. Nigeria, meanwhile, has also decided to destroy around 1 million expired COVID-19 vaccines. The Nigerian health minister said this week that some COVID-19 doses donated by rich Western countries had a remaining shelf life of only weeks. That means, inevitably, that some go to waste. Just 6% of the total population across Africa has so far been vaccinated against the virus. With just 6% of its population vaccinated, just 5 African countries, less than 1/10 of the total number of African nations, are projected to hit the WHO's year-end target of fully vaccinating 40% of its people. This comes as the region grapples to meet rising demand for essential vaccination commodities, including syringes, amid that surge in Omicron cases. A wave of attacks on rural communities by Islamist groups has displaced over 2 million people across Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger. In Dori, a small town in Burkina Faso, children are on the edge of facing acute food shortages. The town's once bustling livestock market has shut down due to violence, and there is no way for residents to earn a livelihood.
The town of Dori in Burkina Faso. It was once a bustling trading hub near the border with Niger. Now, people are battling a burgeoning population, a rise in Islamist attacks and climate change. At the local medical clinic, 9-month-old Sakinatu Amadou is recovering from malnutrition. Her mother died and her grandmother is now the matriarch of the family of 14. They are among more than 2 million across Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger who have been forced from their homes by a wave of attacks by Islamist groups. And with crop yields further compromised by erratic rainfall, some 5.5 million people in the 3 countries on the edge of the Sahara are facing food shortages. The town's once bustling livestock market has shut down due to the violence. Transporting food in the area is dangerous and prices have skyrocketed, said Kadidiatu Ba, who sells vegetables and dried goods from a roadside shack.
Now, nobody wants to come to Dori. Nobody. Once in Ouagadougou, I spoke to a young man who told me even if you pay me 1 million francs, I won't come to Dori.
Meanwhile, Duri's population has nearly tripled in 2 years to 71,000. And the influx of displaced people threatens to overwhelm local services. 3 or 4 children cram behind each desk at this local school. Abdoulaye Boukoum is the headmaster.
Cette année, nous avons reçu 144 élèves déplacés venant des zones.
This year, we've received 144 displaced pupils from areas with a very high security risk. When they came here, they were traumatized children. Parents, when they come to us with their children, you can see an indescribable sadness.
Indescriptible.
He says the school tries to feed each pupil a bowl of rice and beans so they can have at least 1 square meal per day. Beyond that, they're taught how to garden and grow their own vegetables. Skills he hopes will prepare them for life outside the classroom.
Finally today, festive cakes marked the celebration of Santa Lucia Day in Denmark. Hundreds of them, with Christmas lights and decorations, floated through the canals of central Copenhagen. We will leave you with these visuals from wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen. I'm Simon Marks in Washington. Back tomorrow. Thanks for watching WION. World is One. Santa Lucia, Santa Lucia.
So we really like to do Santa Lucia in Kayak Bar because our motto and our purpose to be here is to bring people together. And that's what Santa Lucia means for us, that we can bring people together following the light.